right and wrong, winning and losing, winners and losers. Losers. Ugh. No one wants to be a loser. Like, since Ace Ventura, it's really hit a bit different. Competitiveness, sportsmanship, and playing fair. These are all things we're taught from an early age. We're taught concepts of fairness, equity, equality, and justice. Unless we aren't. Unless those foundations aren't set properly, then everything after would seem pretty fluid, wouldn't it? You know, if really early on in your foundational senses of right and wrong, justice, if those were warped or skewed, if maybe you were taught that winning at whatever cost was okay, so long as you won, that might set you on a completely different life course, don't you think? Well, thankfully, we don't grow up being constantly told to watch our backs and that we could get arrested just for being who we are in public. No, that was sarcasm for the white, straight Christian men listening. You need to get on board. Everybody else gets it. Coming up in the New World Order of Ethical Ambiguity, I'm deconstructing a staple of America's toxic white Southern culture: competition culture. Our obsession with winning. Duh. From owning other humans to owning the libs, to championship riots in the streets, to stormed capitals, to those die-hard, with-you-till-they-die college alumni, to those Patriots, Yankees, and whatever NBA team has Kevin Durant this year, bandwagoners. America is obsessed with either being on the winning team or tearing the winners down, invalidating their accomplishments, if not calling their achievements into question altogether. Well, it isn't all our fault. We're kind of taught to do that, right? In this episode, I'm discussing less about how education can suffer due to sports, but more how our obsession with athletics is contributing to the rise of blind cultism, societal division, the dehumanization of others, and even fascist ideals. I'm breaking down how sports culture, crossing the lines of church and state, opens doors to fascist theology and ideology, and can breed the kinds of cultism that builds a massive and easily manipulatable base. And I will trace the DNA of the treasonous Republican insurrection back to one athletic organization. This certain trend in this organization that possibly contributed to the decline of American ethics and integrity, and one particular sports and pop culture icon who brought America down. And welcome to the podcast, brother. And 80s, there began this rise of gladiator entertainment culture like we'd never seen before. The evolution of media brought access to events one would ordinarily have to leave their house for, or even travel to a large metropolitan area to enjoy. While things like fighting, boxing, wrestling, and the like had been in our culture, media access brought these to the masses right in their homes. The issue with media, though, is that its success is measured by consumption. And what do we know about humans? We consume mass quantities. Portion control ain't an American classic. Plus, we have the attention span of gnats. I can see my video analytics. People get bored easily, even if it's interesting. Eventually, just plain simple fights weren't drawing the audiences. The people wanted drama! Well, what they got were oiled-up beefcakes and makeup and feather boas. Believe me, we're going to cycle back to that. When it comes to athletics and pop culture, there's one organization, one sport, let's say, that stands alone as the prime example for this episode's topic: the erosion of American ethics. We'll get to hockey, baseball, basketball, golf, tennis, racing, and of course football soon enough. Maybe in another episode altogether. Heck, we may even cover pickleball before it's over. Let's up the violence and aggression and examine one of the most brutal and unforgiving athletic entertainment outlets. Let's overthink professional wrestling. Going back to the early days of the ring, There were a lot of unhealthy and toxic stereotypes represented, from Hillbilly Jim and Hacksaw Jim Duggan to Kamala, the African tribesman, and Razor Ramon, who was just Scott Hall with a toothpick, a greased hair, and a really bad accent. In fact, everything from the tights, costumes, makeup, masks, the characters, almost every marginalized group imaginable was lampooned, mocked, or somehow dehumanized in wrestling. Even occupations. They went after our jobs, man. The inappropriate, one-dimensional stereotype tropes flowed freely because, for that particular audience, it was easy to consume, digest, and have that audience latch on to their own preconceived notions and then decide whether they like the characters or not. Then convert that like for cheers, trade up cheers for fears, jeers and beers, and lots of profit, turning that casual fan into a fanatic through, you guessed it, cultism. Many times, good or bad, however, that internal preference or decision usually came down to unhealthy and unrealistic over-the-top representation, misrepresentation. Now, before you think I'm singling out wrestling, the same can be true for comic books, Saturday morning cartoons, video games, and just about every other form of athletics and entertainment media. Washington's football team, please. There's no denial. With wrestling, it was a show, within a show, within a show. A live arena with a rowdy audience and the storylines and the rivals and the ring and, well, in and sometimes out. Then at home, children of all ages glued to the screen to see what would happen next. The lines of reality blurred, even though they shouldn't have been at all. This was entertainment. These were actor-leets, athlete actors, some better than others, but it wasn't real. Well, the intro music and skits they would perform would be mind-blowingly offensive and insensitive by today's standards. Still, professional wrestling thrived by creating heroes and heels, good and bad, this pen and that pen. In the 1960s and 70s, top wrestlers like Stan the Man Stasiak, Crazy Luke Graham, Superstar Billy Graham, Pedro Martinez, Bob Backlund, and the legendary Bruno Sammartino were among the top personalities fans had to root for or against. But with characters like Mr. Fuji, an Asian stereotype, Cold War commie character Ivan Koloff, a Middle Eastern stereotype called the Sheik, countrified Haystacks Calhoun, and of course, the legendary Chief Jay Strongbow, either perpetuating the harmful indigenous stereotypes or celebrating a culture. And that's all dependent on the person seeing it and the person playing it. Fans had easy fodder for bigotry, bias, and prejudice to form without any of the necessary critical thinking to avoid falling prey to those toxic ideas. Look, even Andre the Giant played into some big dumb oaf stereotypes that exist around certain body types thanks to years of misrepresentation in entertainment. There really is some overthinking for almost every single trope in this sport. Big people, little people, we have our first thoughts, and they often aren't productive. Wrestling in this era truly was for entertainment purposes only. You had your good guys and your bad guys, the heroes and the heels, the light side and the dark side. This pen or that pen. Whose side are you on? And for all the woke-ass criticism, when Strongbow did his rain dance in the ring, it was like Hulkamania in there. One might argue, though, this sort of cliched depiction of some of these marginalized groups at least made more people aware of the culture. But at what cost? For some, maybe it made them less biased or more, but the negative stereotypes reinforced without any context or explanation that they are superficial stereotypes and not representative of a norm for that culture or the depth or individuality within that or any culture are far more damaging than we can consider. While professional wrestling isn't an accurate cross-section of many of those in this country who fall prey to cultism, there are some correlations with this culture that intersect with the toxic white Southern culture I'm exploring and deconstructing in this show. Let's look at some other examples to take the heat off of these oiled-up Adonises. Adonai? Either way, Adrian Adonis, for example. While early in his wrestling career, he was a manly leather biker dude. When he ventured into the WWF, now the WWE, after a few years in there, he went from the shtick of agitating to adorable. He gifted his leather jacket to Rowdy Roddy Piper. That's where he got it. And adorable Adrian Adonis became a wrestler known for sexually suggestive gestures, ring attire, and his persona was well, like my beard, just for men. Adrian Adonis was a pretty boy, like Adonis's former tag team teammate Jesse the Body Ventura, and the biggest names like Ric Flair and even Hulk Hogan, and the rest, feather boas, weren't just for Zsa Zsa Gabor and Liz Taylor, ladies. Sometimes the boys liked to parade around like a princess, and parade like a princess Adrian Adonis did. Garish eyeshadow and rouge. He wasn't doing drag, per se. He was more cross-dressing. There's a difference. The wrestler himself, married to a woman with children, but in the ring in the mid-'80s, he pranced about and made everyone uncomfortable. Or maybe not. Gorgeous George sort of laid the groundwork in the 1950s, really. In fact, Gorgeous George sort of opened that door for all of those lavish robes and capes and boas and otherwise not too American manly attire. Men in dresses parading about in what is largely considered feminine attire or mannerisms. This is nothing new to wrestling. Pat Patterson, actually nicknamed Pretty Boy, was an openly gay Canadian wrestler who then got hushed when he moved to the WWF. Like, you can't be gay and be gay. You can be not gay and be gay, but well... Then there was Billy Gunn, who took on many transformations throughout his wrestling career, from the tight jeans, cowboy boots, a duster, and a cowboy hat as a member of the Smokin' Guns. Well, in what is almost a natural art imitating life progression and projection, he eventually evolved into a tag team with another curiously comfortable wrestler named Chuck Palumbo. Now, this was after my childhood fascination with wrestling, and I grew up. But you can Google some of their bits. These guys were all over each other, and their manager, hairdresser, whatever it was, Vito, really sold the whole gay vibe. They didn't have to say anything. These two were like the ambiguously gay duo that was animated shorts from Saturday Night Live. They were stretching each other backstage in these really awkward positions, and then people would come in and they'd be like, What? Why are you leaving? But when it comes to gay in professional wrestling, there is nothing, from my experience, that tops Goldust. Well, one thing, I'll get to that in a moment, but Goldust was the adult son of legendary Dusty Rhodes. The American Dream birthed the gayest wrestler in wrestling history. Look, Adonis just looked feminine. It was camp and really kind of disrespectful cross-dresser shtick. He spoke with his normal voice. It was a look to make men uncomfortable. But Goldust, oh, he was uncomfortable in all the ways. Perfectly played with the tenacity and wrestling pedigree to back it up. He would humiliate and emasculate his opponents just by having them wrestle him. Those watching felt things like embarrassment and horror as a man gyrated on another man. It wasn't that he was doing so non-consensually. That was all fair by the game. It was the dude-on-dudeness. And I will argue, as most will, that it was more the fact that everyone else would know what they thought if they didn't act horrified by it. Some of us still know. But nothing in the history of all my experience personally firsthand with gayness, nothing quite compares to Lex Luger's entrance into the WWF. Lex Luger had carved a successful career everywhere else, so let's try the big stage. Managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan, his shtick in the WWF at first was the narcissist. Narcissus Lex Luger. No humility whatsoever. He'd pose and flex and show off in the ring, Flex Luger. Well, for research purposes only, I rewatched his debut recently too, and it was just as homoerotic, but not in a fun way. The thing is, though, I saw this live on pay-per-view when it aired. I was probably 16, and spoilers, but I secretly thought boys were cute. I still do. But even though I primarily was attracted to girls, I felt really bad about getting in the mood for dude because of how I grew up. And this scene wasn't at all arousing for me. It was disturbing. For nearly 6 minutes, non-stop, Bobby Heenan is shouting, "Yes, yes, Lex, give it to us, Lex. Oh, yes, Lex, it's amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, the perfect male specimen. Don't tease us, Lex, take it all off." For 6 minutes as the camera panned and got every angle, every curve, vein, bead of sweat or oil. And the audience, while plenty of females, but mostly male-dominant demographic, were all drooling. I'm harder now than I was watching it back then. It just didn't do it for me. But I saw what it did for a lot of people. A lot of the sort of people who made me feel bad a lot for just liking boys a little. Now, today, the county in which I live, Knox County, Tennessee, elected a mayor named Glenn Jacobs. You may know him as Fake Diesel, Isaac Yankem DDS, the dentist. I'll discuss that in a bit. But most famously, I guess, he was the Undertaker's Kayfabe brother, Kane. Kayfabe is some weird, made-up pig Latin wrestling industry jargon that it basically means fake, but like secretly fake. Like, don't let anyone know it's fake, but it's fake. So when we say it's kayfabe, we know it just means it's only true in make-believe wrestling land, but in reality, it's a lie that we pretend is true everywhere, and we work really hard to convince people it's true outside the ring and off the TV show. I guess they thought nobody in the world would believe it was real. Kayfabe is wrestling jargon that basically means soap opera storyline. Like, Glenn Jacobs isn't Mark Calloway's biological brother, but in fairy tale fake soap opera story drama Hit You in the Feels land, Kane is the long-lost hellborn brother of the undead, the Undertaker. What the fuck? I can't with that. Look, I've got college degrees. All I'm saying is, Mayor Kane today stands vehemently against the trans and LGBTQ communities. Not just here in Knox County, Tennessee, but as a principle, he is against gay. He's a staunch activist for causes, groups, ideals, and values that contradict and challenge the safety, thriving, and survival of LGBTQ people and allies in this community. He isn't kind or compassionate to them, but he is to white religious extremist Nazis. This isn't opinion, look it up for yourself. His policies, in his own words, don't support people. They support organizations that are built on hatred, bigotry, division, and supremacy, religious or racial. My point here is that homosexuality has been exploited by the organization that Mayor Kane has profited from. And the entire reason he even is the county mayor is due to the exploitation of the LGBTQ community by the likes of Vince McMahon, Adrian Adonis, Dustin Rhodes, Billy Gunn, and others. It was this selling out of values, the values of recognizing human beings as human beings, to use that as fodder for ratings, comedy, or to rile up a sentiment of negativity toward this natural aspect of love. Professional wrestling used homosexuality to stoke feelings of shame, negativity, embarrassment, and hatred in its fans, while the wrestlers played up those emotions in the ring against these culturally appropriating, not-so-gay grapplers. These organizations, individuals, and their fans have used the LGBTQ community, the LGBTQ plight, and the LGBTQ pain as fodder in their testosterone soap opera storylines, with zero context, compassion, or peaceful resolution to that part of the storyline. How many people grew up with some even minor trauma related just to that? Just the trauma of experiencing the dehumanization of others. We have no idea. How would we even quantify that? How old were you when you first became aware of professional wrestling? Just answer that question, don't go any farther. Then we must assume that is the youngest exposure to these sorts of ideas with no context buffer. That's usually around age 8, on average, for boys, okay? If we follow that line of thinking, it's safe to say that there has been at least some negative impact from just this level of harmful stereotyping. We just can't say how bad. I mentioned before that Mayor Kane once played a dentist character. Well, it wasn't just homosexuality and gender that took wrestling jabs. There was a whole era where one-dimensional jobbers came through the ring. Actually, A jobber is a wrestler who just goes in and takes the crap matches, takes the falls, and helps those rising stars or comeback stories advance, I think. These profession or trade-based job characters weren't anything that would leave a lasting impression beyond the questionable ideas and stereotypes they reinforced. The most popular, of course, is the aforementioned undead Undertaker. He was literally supposed to be an Undertaker, or a zombie, or like Solomon Grundy meets Frankenstein's monster, but without all the patchwork. A resurrected corpse? Look, I still don't know, but portly bleach blonde wrestling manager Percy Pringle donned anemic face makeup and goth attire to go all Addams Family as Paul Bearer, Undies manager, whenever Mark Calloway's character would take a beat down in similar Hulkamania style of an unbelievable yet way overplayed comeback. Paul Bearer would hold up the magical urn of whatever who knows, and Undertaker would sit right up, no matter what. And you were doomed. The funeral industry really is a scam that preys on your grief and guilt. Then there was the IRS, the accountant character, Irwin R. Shyster. He later changed his name to Michael Wall Street. The stockbroker character, without having to change much at all. An accountant or stockbroker in a wrestling match. Let's overthink the Shyster part. While it isn't etymologically anti-Semitic, many people who don't know that associate the term with the dehumanization of the Jewish community. If not, then at very least the dehumanization of lawyers, the word's origin. It's a word created almost 200 years ago to combat corruption in the legal system, but the 20th century's intellectual evolutionary decline suggests that maybe it's more in line with wrestling's status quo of not caring about that sort of distinction more than perpetuating easily digestible stereotypes. It doesn't stop there. The Repo Man? A literal repo man who had cut up tires as knee pads? Not as bad as T.L. Hopper, the plumber, or Duke Dumpster Drozy, an actual garbage man, or sanitation engineer. And everybody just forgot that Undertaker's brother used to be a dentist with a really rotten smile. Isaac Yankem DDS didn't last long, but his whole thing was pulling teeth. Much like watching Glenn Jacobs wrestle or govern. Seriously, does professional wrestling's audience need to be more afraid of dentists? Brutus the Barber Beefcake, it speaks for itself. Before he went all blonde and hardcore, Bob Holly was Sparkplug, the Southern race car driver by day and wrestler by night. Well, he won the tag team title with wrestling's kindergarten character, the 1-2-3 Kid. You had football players, baseball and hockey players, a college dean, bodybuilders, fitness gurus, even boxers, which made more sense. Even Macho Man's brother was the genius. Fandango, the ballroom dancer. Doink, the clown. The Big Moss Man was a prison guard and a corrupt one at that. Oh, Big Boss Man free with that nightstick. Now, before Bastion Booger grossed everyone out as the obese, overeating, clearly depressed with an eating disorder, poor hygiene trope, he was Friar Ferguson, a monk who wrestled. The Mountie, Canadian legendary prick and overall hated individual in and out of the ring, no kayfabe necessary, Jacques Rougeau, who was, you guessed it, a cattle prod wielding Canadian Mountie. Unmounted, of course. Speaking of mounted, Val Venus was an adult entertainment star character who also wrestled. I just can't imagine that would be like. Wouldn't it be awkward to be like in a leg lock and just look over like, dude, saw your video with the pizza delivery and the mom? Very impressive. Kegels? Charles Wright. While he was also voodoo priest Papa Shango and Kama Mustafa, he was also the Godfather, who was a Huggy Bear level stereotypical pimp character who came to the ring with his hoes, who were usually professional adult entertainers from wherever the match was that night. Shop local. Cultural and occupational stereotypes that risk forever cementing as indoctrination in one's mind. The ideas, fears, suspicions, or validations of preconceived notions. How old were you the first time you became aware of professional wrestling? Sexuality and gender-bending characters and one-dimensional occupational characters aside, let's discuss some of the other harmful stereotypes that have been perpetuated by professional wrestling throughout the years. There's the madman from Sudan, Abdullah the Butcher, really a Canadian named Larry Shreve, who ended up with permanent scars all over his forehead from being cut and busted open so many times wrestling. Then, because nobody said that wasn't okay, several years later, the African tribesman cannibal character Kamala would debut. The Ugandan giant, complete with grass skirt, spear, wooden mask, and seemingly primitive, if not savage behavior. Well, I'll just say it. Look, go watch his footage. Many of his mannerisms were primate in nature, and it's hard to believe that wasn't a character development discussion that took place backstage, maybe in a boardroom full of people who look a little bit too much like me. Anyway, he had to be escorted to the ring on a chain by a white handler. I'm sure that was harmless. Speaking of African stereotypes, do you remember George Gray? He debuted as the gigantic street thug one-man gang from Chicago. He came to the ring with two black men. His manager, Slick, a stereotypical jive-talking slickster, and his tag team partner, a bleach blonde-haired Butch Reed. Then this large white man decided that he was really African and changed his entire persona. He then stood tall in a Dashikian headdress as a black man from, quote, the deepest, darkest Africa. And he was really just a big white guy. He was white. Akeem was white. And that's not a one-off story, folks. In the days before deliberate diversity mattered, nobody checked your 23andMe to see if you really were what you were playing. Remember Native American legend Chief Jay Strongbow? He wasn't indigenous to anything. Italian-American Joe Scarpa did the rain dance that made everybody go wild. Does that put things into a different perspective? I mentioned Razor Ramon was just Scott Hall in Latin face, very bad Latin face. Well, Yokozuna, the Japanese sumo wrestler who was so big he couldn't be taken down. I mean, he did, but he got so big he couldn't move anymore. But still, he was Japanese, right? No, he wasn't. He was Samoan. He's related to Roman Reigns, The Rock, and pretty much every other Samoan wrestler you know of. Fatu or Rikishi, hell, it gets complicated. More on Asian stereotypes. Mr. Fuji, who'd go on to become one of the most ruthless and conniving managers in wrestling, wasn't above cheating as a wrestler or a manager. Actually, that's a trademark heel move. We'll get to that in a bit. But when a society is conditioned to not trust people of a certain heritage over decades and decades of wars and propaganda, this becomes a very problematic stereotype to reinforce. Eddie Guerrero, one of the all-time greats, amped up his Latin heat, but also played to some harmful reinforcement of stereotypes against the Latin community of dishonesty and a criminal nature. Lie, cheat, and steal was the motto for a while. His wife even exploited his death in the name of Kayfabe. Here we are again, the heels doing whatever it takes while the hero loses the belt and is carried backstage bloodied, while the ref has no idea what just happened. And let's discuss the fact that most of the foreign-born heel characters weren't born where they're representing. Most of those Cold War Russian tropes weren't Russians at all, not even Nikolai Volkov. Many who are portrayed as one nationality or another are from Canada or the US, maybe Europe. Yet here they are putting on the harmful and misrepresented depictions of people, an entire people, their culture, and heritage. Much of this is used to exploit our base-level emotions. Those are the easiest to convert to cultism. The advanced stages of fandom, where fandom devolves to fanaticism. I've talked about how post 9/11, President Bush's desperation to rally America was apparent. Not being a deeply intellectual man or someone who cared enough to seek the advice of those who were, Bush's play was to rally us around fear and hatred, revenge. It was the fastest and easiest path to unity and profit, or at least projecting an image of unity. I explained how that act alone sold our souls as it went against almost every ancient religious doctrine and teaching. They pretty much all say, even the Jedi, that turning to anger, fear, paranoia, hate, it leads to the dark side, the downfall of man. I talked about how country radio played into that with songs like Toby Keith's The Angry American, brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue. We'll put a boot in your ass, it's the American way. There were a lot of harmful and negative ideas that were perpetuated through that to exploit the emotions and patriotism of an audience. I know firsthand. I did it. I wrote and produced things that would elicit that ooh-rah America feel so people would like my station more. Just like a company that uses an American flag or religious imagery in their branding, it was exploitation and completely wrong. Manipulating a volatile powder keg I couldn't begin to understand. Wrestling did the same thing. The only Iranian-born champion in WWF WWE history, Olympian Hossein Khosrow Ali Varizi, was the heel America needed when America maybe needed to heal more than we needed a racist stereotype heel. In the 1980s, the Iron Sheik was a dominant force pushing Middle Eastern stereotypes to the limits. He won the championship belt in 1983 and entertained the masses with a rivalry that would make Hulk Hogan a real American hero and pop culture patriot icon. The Iron Sheik would provide the Hulkster his first title that year. The wrestler came and went and ran into some legal issues, but he would return to the organization in the early 90s, typecast as the almost identical but differently costumed Iraqi Colonel Mustafa, to destroy another real American hero, G.I. Joe action figure and wrestling legend Sergeant Slaughter. It was during the first Gulf War where Sheiky solidified himself as the bad guy, turning the all-American patriot drill sergeant heel and uniting with another almost identical Middle Eastern heel stereotype, General Adnan, as Iraqi sympathizers, as American lives were at risk every day at the height of the war in the Middle East. The first one. The first one. Well, then there's the really messed up storyline of Muhammad Hussan, who was of Italian and Jordanian heritage, but played a Middle Eastern Arab American whose shtick was to make people aware of how Muslim and Arab peoples were being misrepresented in those times. Seems okay. Quite progressive and responsible for the company that brought us Kamala, the Ugandan giant. Well, there's a whole martyr sacrifice storyline against The Undertaker that played out the same night as the London subway bombings. Completely unrelated and unintended, but still not completely harmless either. Many of these stereotypes are presented with no context and no healthy balance of perspective. When someone grows up in a more sheltered environment, they only know what they see, hear, and learn, what they're told to believe. This is why education is so important. But diversity is also so vital. Accurate diversity, deliberate diversity, diversity of people, diversity of ideas. But that access to diversity is not a license to push harmful ideas. So to those of you who look like me, you can't say the things or tell the jokes just because you have a black friend. Just like Aesop's fable about the fox and the lion I told in an episode before, acquaintance weakens prejudice. A more diverse atmosphere early in life, the earlier the better, is the best way to keep us from accepting or worse, pushing harmful ideas to others, reinforcing and validating them in the first place. Professional wrestling's blind cult loyalty to the principle of Kayfabe, that secret soap opera storyline everyone upholds as real no matter what, further blurred those lines of reality in a time when is Goldust really gay or is Farouk really a Black Panther could be easily Googled. Professional wrestling blurred those lines of fact and fantasy for an audience that wasn't trained to see the difference when they didn't know no better and couldn't easily correct that error. Instead, Wrestling Hall of Famer, former professional football player Ron Simmons, the first African American to win the WCW World Heavyweight belt, came to the WWF as Farouk Assad, which, I apologize in advance, but various sources describe his character as street thug. This new take on Simmons' persona reminded fans of organizations like the Black Panthers or the Nation of Islam as it's been misrepresented in the media. In that, Ron Simmons portrayed the angry black intimidator activist trope. He wouldn't be the first or last. He built a stable of other wrestler allies. They weren't all black, but to the superficially trained brain, the imagery was clear. So were the ideas those images conveyed. Images of fear. This wasn't a stable of heroes, even if The Rock was a part of it. The Rock was a heel back then. The Rock, one of the most likable, if not politically confusing wrestling personalities ever, he has successfully transitioned from the poof-haired, colorfully clad son of a wrestling legend who shared said legend's name to becoming the biggest name in professional wrestling and one of the biggest box office draws in Hollywood. The Rock has become legend, surpassing even his father. But The Rock went bad. He turned heel. Whether that was Kayfabe or Dwayne Johnson just got tired of the cheers and said, "Smell what my ass is cooking." Some might have a hard time distinguishing. He wasn't the first babyface to turn heel. He wouldn't be the last. The good guy goes bad. Maybe he wasn't ever good. Maybe he can't ever be totally good again. Are we even good? Kind of like what America did with America. Our own society. And maybe some of the blame for our current societal division and this erosion of our integrity and ethics is due to the rise and fall of America's greatest hero, the real American. Our society loves to build up our heroes just to watch them fall. This has never been more apparent than with America's greatest athletic pop culture patriotic icon, Hulk Hogan. Say whatever you want about Hulk Hogan, but he was more than a wrestler, which is good because he wasn't a very good wrestler. Well, at least by wrestling standards. He was big, tan, blonde, had the Fu Manchu stash, those 24-inch pythons. That wasn't a homoerotic dog whistle at all. He was a real American. He fought for the rights of every man. When the intro music played, "I am a real American. I fight for the rights of every man." The Hulkamania was like breathing the ether. The energy would roll through the crowd. Hulk would come into the arena, hand to his ear, so he could hear the crowd cheer for him, draped in an American flag, referencing and praising God and wearing a gold cross necklace to the ring. Decked out in a do-rag, yellow and red tights, and a thin Hulkamania shirt he'd then tear off before the match. Hogan was the WWF. Hogan was the every fan. A blonde-haired, white Christian, patriotic American. He was the real American. When he would struggle, because he was not a good wrestler, the crowd held their breath as Hulkster began to shake, and shake some more. And as Hulkster shook, so did we all shake. You could feel that energy, the addictive, contagious, supernatural energy of Hulkamania take over the entire venue. The noise was deafening, and Hogan would go on to, predictably, yet somehow against all odds, win. Most of the time. Until he lost, which isn't usually their choice. Most of those outcomes are decided for storyline purposes and have more to do with wrestler contracts than actual spontaneous pinfalls. A lot of what happens in the ring might be real. The rest might look real, but the outcomes are rarely surprising to the writers. When Hogan was written off WWF for the first time in 1993, it was after a shift in the audience atmosphere which could be traced back to SummerSlam 1991, where The Undertaker, the heel, got cheers, while Hulkster still had the support of the crowd. It clearly wasn't one-sided anymore. The audience somehow liked the bad guy better than the American hero. For some reason, this dark, brooding, undead Hollywood Halloween cosplayer was what fans wanted more than the yellow and red clad saccharine feel-good echo from a bygone John Wayne Reagan era. By 1993, Hulkster's shtick as the real American was getting tired as America's consistent inconsistence of infusing politics and pop culture. Also getting tired was him winning while consistently being outmatched by better athletes and personalities. Between feuds with Vince McMahon, the WWF's huge steroid scandal, well, Hogan's days as the face of the WWF were done. He headed over to rival WCW, where he'd milk Hulkamania for a few more years. What you may not know is that Hulk Hogan had to pay Marvel Comics for the use of the name Hulk. So in 1996, when he ran into the ring to help Kevin Nash and the only slightly less stereotypical Scott Hall on WCW's Monday Nitro, essentially joining the NWO, changing his name and persona to Hollywood Hogan, weirdly dyeing only the stubble black, and ditching the bright primaries for the apropos black and white, Hollywood Hogan no longer had to pay Marvel to use Hulk. Good for Hulkster's bank account, right? Bad for America. Bad for Hulk's fans. Well, it's your guess what him turning heel said to them. Hulk Hogan can turn heel. Look, if Hulk Hogan can go bad, if Hulk Hogan can compromise his ethics just to win, then was Hulkamania ever real? Hulk Hogan stood for America, so, is that even real? Hulk Hogan stood for God, so, we know what it did to his fans. Watch the video. They littered the ring for minutes with trash, boos, and outrage from fans who had hung on to their very ideals of patriotism, America, ethics, sportsmanship, competition, and God. Rested on the shoulders of an oiled-up 3D cartoon character, the fictional creation of a narcissistic sociopathic madman named Vince McMahon. You see, that's the business side of it, the capitalism aspect. Ambitions and greed, like I mentioned before. Like on a soap opera or TV show, your favorite character gets a movie deal and bails, or they want more money and they're killed off. Happens all the time. Well, wrestling is just a TV show. A well-choreographed, loosely scripted, but completely planned out and outlined TV show. These aren't fighters or actors or athletes or dancers. They're all those things, and then some. Goldberg ended the legendary Bret Hart's career way too early, with just a simple boot to the face. Look at these moves. If you aren't trained in how to take a hit and fake a hit and how to make it look real while faking it, somebody's going to die. Wrestling isn't something to dismiss or knock. It's technical. It is boxing, MMA, and traditional wrestling mixed with ballet, trapeze, and parkour, and then some. But with drama and, pardon the pun, Rick and Charlotte, flair. But it's just a TV show. It is for entertainment purposes only, after all. Tell that to Chris Benoit's family. That tragedy linked directly to an example of the consequences of professional wrestling. Turned the company to a watered-down era for a while, almost trepidatious on crossing too many extreme storylines. The whole thing was kind of bland and vanilla for a bit. Otherwise known as the rise of John Cena. In the late 80s and into the 90s, Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man, Donald Trump with a beard and tights, basically, was the heel of all heels. He was rich and obnoxious about it. He'd stuff $100 bills in his defeated opponents' mouths. He was a great talker and a good wrestler. With a sleeper hold finisher, the $1 Million Dream, he'd put his rivals nighty-night all tight and tighty, more than getting his $1 Million mug all battered and bruised. Often, his bodyguard, Virgil, the silent African-American non-consensual servant to the rich white man. I think it was a sick mother or something Teddy was holding over Virgil's head to keep him in his place. I don't know. Another paid henchman, or Virgil, would come in and clobber DiBiase's opponent behind the ref's back and take care of all the dirty work. Other times, he'd buy off the ref, pay another wrestler to interfere, or even pay off his opponent to take a fall. He created his own diamond-encrusted $1 Million belt and insisted it be adopted by the organization as an actual championship, setting his rules in their game. Money talked. Everybody had a price. Everybody's gonna pay. Doesn't matter who you are or what you are. If you're the richest guy, you make the rules after all. Monopoly? The progress of board games? Remember? The $1 Million Man, capitalism personified, would talk to audience members, hear some sob story, dangle his wealth in their face, and then just turn heel on them. One time, a little African-American kid, maybe 8 tops, is in the spotlight with DiBiase. He says something like, "Oh, you look hungry. You look like your family could use $300. Are mommy and daddy poor? Well, if you can," and then he'd offer some seemingly simple task, maybe a bit challenging for somebody, and you'd think that, okay, even if the kid muffs it, dude's gonna give him something for trying. He's on television. What he gave the kid on live pay-per-view was a hard lesson in real-world consequences for failure. He told the kid to shove off, blamed him to his face for his family not getting the $300 they clearly so desperately needed, and then he laughed, cackled, an evil laugh, as the sad little black boy was ushered off the podium, while Virgil just stood there. Everybody has a price. Everybody's gonna pay. Everybody. Look, even if that kid was an actor, the look on his face was not one of an actor who could appropriately process the make-believe or that level of inhumanity and lack of compassion. For that child alone, actor or just some kid the producers pulled from the crowd to stand up and just look sad while the wrestler did his bit, doesn't matter. The developing human brain processing that complexity of pretending something so horrible. More on that in the next episode. But imagine how traumatic that might have been for someone else watching it, of any age. Whether we want to admit this or not, that level of shocking, inhumane behavior and complete evil, absence of empathy, is traumatic. The $1 Million Man was a different heel than most, but one reflective of a certain aspect of America's social personality, a side many aspired to secretly, that uber-wealthy, I'll show them one day when my ship comes in fantasy. That aspiration of wealth for revenge rather than using it for good. I mentioned with Eddie Guerrero and Mr. Fuji and how the heels not only always seem to play into a bad stereotype, but always seem to be one step ahead of our heroes, or baby faces as wrestling calls them. When faced with an opponent willing to break the rules to win a match, your choice is to what? Well, you can uphold your integrity and ethics and play fair, and lose. Or you can fight fire with fire, or steel chairs, brass knuckles hidden in your shorts, a mighty kick from the manager ringside. Whatever it takes to win, right? After all, you're not the one compromising your values. You tried to play fair, and it just didn't work. You're just playing their game by their rules so you can beat them, right? Even though their rules aren't the rules, sometimes the rules aren't upheld, and it seems unfair. So when it's unfair, you have to do whatever it takes to get back in the game, right? If your team doesn't win, well, I guess all your allies just run in and storm the ring, stealing the championship belt and declaring the match was rigged, huh? In NASCAR, the phrase "rubbin's racin'" is a well-known dismissal of dangerous and unfair driving, cheating. The idea here is that in a high-speed auto race, in order to gain a competitive advantage against another driver, one might tap that driver's car with their car, bumper to bumper, rub up against them, nudge them out of the way like we all kind of secretly want to do on the interstate sometimes. But this is not only dangerous and incredibly unfair, it could be deadly. It has been deadly. Yet, I've heard my entire life from race fans this term in jest, and not whenever a driver races a little dirty. "Rubbin's racing!" some shout. When we think about sportsmanship and competition, and how those ideals and principles are tied to our work ethic and sense of patriotism, pride, and spirituality, and all those feel-good juices that our brains release when our team wins, and then we compromise the ethics behind it all, well, sometimes we'll do whatever it takes just to feel those feel-good juices again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Even if it means accepting a big old lie. It's hard to argue that America's national pastime has shifted from baseball in the early 20th century to football today. Maybe thanks to the infection of capitalism, strikes, or steroids to get those home run title asterisks. Football, college and pro, even high school in some places, is big business and fundamental to America's culture, but also specifically to the toxic white Southern culture I'm talking about. A lot of these themes will come back up as we go along, but consider college football's dirty little secret. For years, we've all known colleges pay some players under the table. We know it goes on. We always have. We know it goes on pretty much everywhere. We know that corruption has infiltrated not only a sport many enjoy, but the education and academic pursuits of all students. We've accepted with penalties and sanctions and bowl bans that some college football programs are going to get caught making promises in the recruiting process that they probably shouldn't have made. The 1994 film Blue Chips is a great example of this. Even though the Nick Nolte Shaquille O'Neal movie was about college basketball, Nick Nolte's coach Pete Bell is torn with the conflict of remaining relevant in the late stages of his career or going out a loser and tarnishing his legacy just for the sake of some archaic sense of ethics and standards no one but he seemed to follow anymore. All around him, he sees those peers selling out their values to recruit the best players in the country right out from under him. Literally, at any cost. Spoilers, in the end, Bell has to decide if he's going to conform to the new normal of college recruiting. Does he promise his hopeful new point guard's mom a new house and job, a new car for his 7-foot-tall center? Or does he hold to his values and standards and rules of the game that he's always known, loved, revered, and respected, held sacrosanct, and hope that those players make the right ethical choices? Back to football. Let's look at the pros. We know that the NFL has known about brain injury science for much longer than we'd all like to admit. We sort of ignore that. I mean, after all, those players are playing by their own choice. They aren't prisoners, right? Yes, parents still let their children play football. I mean, at what point do we charge them with child abuse or neglect? I said it, so should you. Still, with two of the top teams of the last 2 decades, the New Orleans Saints and the New England Patriots, you've got Spygate, Deflategate, and numerous other ethically questionable scandals all over the league. Corking the bats, juicing up McGuire, Sosa, Canseco, and Bonds, and knocking homers. Stick 'em. It's in baseball, too. Even basketball. Even hockey. Yet our very foundational ideas of sportsmanship, our ideals of competitiveness, fairness, the ideas of teamwork, winning and losing, community as a strength, those are directly tied to these organizations and the games they play. Back to professional wrestling. Part of the drama is the unpredictability of it all. Shawn Michaels turns on his old buddy and tag team partner Marty Jannetty with a karate kick to the jaw right through a glass window. The Rockers are no more, and thus is born the Heartbreak Kid. It broke my heart. But like Mr. Perfect, I really came to embrace Shawn's alpha, arrogant, self-proclaimed sex icon persona. Before he died tragically, Owen Hart, one of the greatest aerial wrestlers of our time, turned on his own brother, the legendary champion Bret the Hitman Hart. Now, some of this is scripted storylines, sure, but to the below-average consumer, these are far more than storylines. The lines between truth and reality can blur unless one is either naturally gifted at or trained in critical thinking. While there are some seriously problematic tropes still represented, or misrepresented, as our culture has evolved beyond just accepting toxic stereotypes, so has the World Wrestling Federation, who is now, thanks to a lawsuit from the World Wildlife Federation, World Wrestling Entertainment. When it was no longer cool to characterize people and represent entire cultures with a cartoonish character in the ring, well, all the good guys and the bad guys kind of started looking alike. This not only makes branding, marketing, and escalating that fandom to cultism difficult, thus unprofitable, This tends to get confusing for a culture trained to clearly recognize the enemy. A culture almost indoctrinated to identify key physical traits or characteristics that make identifying the opposite. Oh, come on, don't make me say it. Again, it's entertainment. So maybe some of this is just harmless, right? This whole episode could be played as woke satire after all. But is it? So long as one possesses the critical thinking required to look beyond the trope and acknowledge that there is more to learn about it, yes. You may still be thinking, this is satire, right? Is he really suggesting that American society turned heel when Hulk Hogan turned heel? No. But yes. I believe there's a timeline correlation, or at least coincidence. Maybe art imitated life. Maybe life was influenced by the art. There are some things I've discovered about this segment of American society, not wrestling fans, but those I've spoken about before. Those who seem to lack the critical thinking and compassion. Those who have fallen prey to the cultism. Not of a president, or of personality, or even a brand or sport. The cultism of the dumbing down and numbing down of America. That's not wrestling. Wrestling's just one example, a fun one I thought you'd enjoy deconstructing. This is much, much bigger than sports, bigger than geography, bigger than politics, bigger than religion, bigger than race. But it certainly touches all of those. The thing with wrestling that really sets it apart in this discussion is the dangerous Venn diagram at play. Socially, culturally, professional wrestling is a hybrid of sports, soap operas, competitive game shows, televangelism, and reality television. Just like with actual soap operas, individual ambitions, struggles, conflicts, capitalism, and greed play with our emotions. Performers want different things, disagree with the writing, want more money, or succumb to injuries or drugs. Either way, our favorite characters are never here to stay for too long, leading us to grieve, mourning, coping with a loss that we never really truly embrace as a loss. But haven't we all felt something during the series finale of our favorite show? A real emotion tied to a fake story. Even if they aren't for you, these lines are blurred way too much for many in the audience, I'm afraid. These types of programs almost insist that we, the audience, take it one step further than normal content consumption. They want us involved. They want us so involved that we're hooked and can't turn away. We have to see what's next. It's almost like a drug. In fact, to our brains and the chemicals released, that level of cultism can be, not just for wrestling, but any kind of entertainment media we consume, which I'm discussing more in the next episode. The more real, the better for that part of our brain. Or worse, perspective. Wrestling. A gladiator sport built around aggression, betrayal, and toxic competitiveness, was the natural selection for this episode. While all professional sports fall prey to this cultism, it's the addictive, enrapturing, and often indistinguishable from reality storylines and characters that set professional wrestling's impact on society apart from any other professional athletic organization or entertainment media. And much of that is so entrenched into our pop culture that even if you say, well, I've never really watched wrestling, Josh, you've still been influenced or impacted by it on some level. Those ripple effects, as I've discussed. Wrestling, like it or not, is that woven into our social and pop culture fabric. What happens when dehumanizing others is encouraged and those negative ideas or stereotypes are validated and reinforced on primetime and pay-per-view for decades by some of our biggest athletic, entertainment, and pop culture icons? What happens when those icons we hold up as heroes and examples of such higher principles disappoint us? What happens when our sensibilities of good and bad, right and wrong, loyalty and justice are tied up in people, or worse yet, fictional characters, rather than ideas and ideals? what happens when we deconstruct why we are loyal to what we are loyal, even if it's as seemingly silly as sports figures, and trace those breadcrumbs back to their origins. We get rocked to our core. It's why more people don't do this. It's why my book will never be a bestseller. It's why this show will never be a hit. And don't worry, it was never meant to be. It's not why I'm doing this. When the very foundations of our principles become fluid, all of our principles, values, morals, ethics, our social norms and mores all become fluid as well. The thing about deconstructing is we're also deconstructing ourselves, which means we then have to put ourselves back together again. All too often, there are no kings, no horsemen, no men, just us doing it alone, in our own heads. Maybe we have a therapist. Yeah, this will never be number one anything. This journey isn't for the faint of heart. This is a journey you've got to be ready for. Coming up, I'm taking this topic and previous episode themes to another level with For Entertainment Purposes Only, a human mathematical equation type examination into some of our pop culture as a psychological personality case study on myself, you, and society as a whole. Using my running theme of perspective, those hats we wear or lenses through which we see the world, I'm exploring this dumbing down and numbing down of society. And it's hard to argue the garbage in, garbage out theory of consumption doesn't hold. I may spoil some of your most memorable attachments to books, movies, music, television, and sports, and more. But I want us to look at some very important entertainment media examples in a slightly different way in preparation for another Overthinking Everything offering and train our brains to spot those problematic themes, ideas, and misrepresentations for what they are up front, so maybe we can still enjoy these things that probably didn't age as well as we'd like. We'll look at how these seemingly harmless character shows and examples have impacted our collective social personality by normalizing some very toxic, or at best, morally flexible ideas, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultures. Thanks for joining me. Check out all my other videos on YouTube. There's a lot of them. I've got all my original music, my TikToks, all the Overthinking Everything, and all the clips, all my acting and voiceover work. It's all organized in playlists for you on my YouTube. Check out my merch store, the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. You can get all your trigger gear there. Follow me on TikTok, like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and look, do all the things I need you to do if you like this series. You might want to consider a donation to Cash App. This is my full-time job. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm Overthinking Everything. Professional wrestlers are constantly putting their bodies on the line in the ring. The high-risk, high-impact nature of their profession means that many wrestlers don't live to see old age. In fact, the average lifespan of a professional wrestler is just 45 years. Many of your favorite wrestlers, the legendary names, died much younger due to issues tied to their lifestyle and profession. While this certainly is a tragedy, it's not entirely surprising. What is surprising, however, is the cause of death for many wrestlers. Rather than dying from injuries sustained in the ring, many wrestlers die from drug overdoses or suicides. The depressingly high rate of drug abuse and suicide in the wrestling world is likely due to the constant pressure to perform through pain. Wrestlers are expected to be larger-than-life characters, and they often feel like they have to live up to that persona both in and out of the ring, thanks to Kayfabe. This can be a lot of pressure, and it's not surprising that some wrestlers turn to drugs or alcohol to cope. Unfortunately, This often leads to tragic consequences. Overdoses and suicides are all too common in the wrestling world, and they serve as a reminder of the dark side of this high-pressure profession. If you or someone you know is struggling with depression, addiction, or suicidal thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are resources available, and it's important to seek professional help if you're feeling overwhelmed. Remember, it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to go through this alone. If you or someone you know is considering suicide, please call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 or the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Make the call that saved my life and could have saved my brother's. Help is available. You are not alone.